I'm Jane Suby, Member Services Advocate at CCOF. We're grateful and excited to welcome Mas Masumoto to tell us about his recent book, Secret Harvests, A Hidden Story of Separation and the Resilience of a Family Farm, and other thoughts that he has on his mind. From a reader's perspective, Mas Masumoto is the author of 14 books, including Harvest Sun, Planting Roots in American Soil, Wisdom of the Last Farmer, Harvesting Legacies from the Land, and his most well-known, Epitaph for a Peach, 4 Seasons on My Family Farm. Writing in the great tradition of rural philosophers such as Wendell Berry and Henry David Thoreau, Moss takes on epic themes of commitment to family and land, the rootedness of organic farming, dark sides of American history, and the fragility of the family farm. From a CCOF perspective, Masumoto Family Farm has the client ID of FT011, the 11th operation that CCOF certified in the Fresno-Tulare region. And by the way, Mas, if you haven't already, I encourage you to apply for certification cost share.
I've already done that. So.
Oh, good. First certified organic in 1990, the farm's public profile reads, "At Masumoto Family Farm, we believe we grow stories. We cultivate organic peaches, nectarines, and grapes that all show who our farm is and the care we put into it. The power of food lies in these stories and is exchanged when it's eaten with friends and family. Please join me in welcoming a national treasure, Mas Masumoto."
Oh, thank you. You're very kind with that. Thank you, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for CCUF hosting this. And what I'll probably do today is go over some of the the backstory of Secret Harvest, and then we'll talk a little bit more, maybe do a little readings here and there. I might talk a little bit about some of my other books, and certainly want to engage with all of you too, and whatever questions you might have on that. This book was really anchored in farming. And I know when I first talked with my editor, they said, well, wait a minute, really? I said, no, it's the backstory that embeds in this. In fact, farming becomes a character in the book, but it doesn't come out necessarily right away, but it's very important. So the very first paragraph, in a way, I think anchors this, and I'll read a part of that. I farm with ghosts. They live in our fields. Each peach tree has the pruning scars from generations who worked these orchards. Each vine has been shaped by hands of workers who returned each year to add their touch to the sculpture. People and their families have etched their marks on my farm, and I too hope to leave behind a simple signature on the seemingly ordinary landscape. Ghosts inhabit our family history. And that is exactly the beginning of this story, and also of how farming weaves its way into this and is definitely part of that legacy of our farm. And now I thought we'd sort of begin this discussion with a very short video that Jane would like to show you now. And it's like a book trailer. It lasts about 30 seconds. So I hope you enjoy it. Jane, anytime. A decade ago, I discovered a mysterious Aunt Shizuko. We assumed she had died 70 years ago, but she was alive a few miles from our farm. I thought I knew my family. I now farm with ghosts. And in many ways, that is the introduction of the book. Suddenly you say, wait a minute, there's an aunt, a lost aunt that you've been separated for 70 years. Where does this come from, and how does it connect? And to give you just a little bit of the backstory, it all began actually with a phone call that I got from a funeral home. And I remember getting in, it was in early 2012, I believe it was. And I had an answering machine back then. And I said, is this one of those calls that they're trying to get me to buy an early package at the funeral home, and so I didn't return it. And they phoned 3 times, and my wife finally said, "You better return the call." And I phoned them back, and they said, "This is this Renee Johnson from Wild Rose Funeral Home in Fresno," and she said that, "Is your mom Carol Sugimoto?" And that was my mom's maiden name. I said, "Yes," and she said, "Well, her sister, we've been given a contract to help with her last rites, and we'd like to reach out to the family." And I said, "What are you talking about? I know all my aunts. I don't understand this." So I went in to visit with her, and she had the 1930 census, and it sure enough showed Shizuko Sugimoto and my mom's name with her too, as part of my family, along with all my other uncles and aunts. And it turned out that Shizuko was this aunt that I knew very, very little of. We had no record of her. There was no photograph of her. And what had happened was when she was a child, in 1925, she got meningitis, and it attacked her. A lot of pressure on her brain, and she became intellectually disabled at that time. And disabilities back in that era was really tough, and families, especially a rural family, Japanese American, they treated it very in a very common way, which was they carried a lot of shame with it. They took care of her, but she was sort of hidden, like many people with disabilities were back then and continue sadly today. Then World War II broke out, and that's where all Japanese Americans were interned, imprisoned during the war because they looked like the enemy. And a question for my family, who were farm workers at that time. We did not own land. And actually, let me back up a moment. One of the embedded stories in Secret Harvest had to do with land ownership. And some of you may know, but Japanese Americans, along with other Orientals, they had alien land laws in the West Coast, in California especially, that prevented them from owning land. So my grandparents, who immigrated early 1900s, could not own land, but they were farm workers and they wanted to stay here. So my parents grew up as farm workers, worked in the fields, and Shizuko was part of that, but she had this disability. So she grew up with that until World War II. Then when internment happened, the family was faced with this decision, what do we do with Shizuko? Since they had no idea where they would be going, and they ended up going to this prison in the Arizona desert, Gila River Relocation Center, south of Phoenix. But they didn't know what to do, so my aunt became a what they called back then a ward of the state. And she was became, and they signed papers over, so she was now officially part of the state and had, in a way, nothing to do with family. We thought she had passed away, and it was 70 years later I got that phone call from the funeral home saying that this woman is alive, and now became the whole process of trying to unravel this family secret that we all carried with us and trying to understand that dynamics. And again, part of that was woven into the fabric of our farm and farming. Ironically, because I farm and I'm still farming on the same land that my dad bought after the war, it was easy for this funeral home to look me up. And I thought, how did they get my phone number? When my dad had passed away in 2010, I wrote the obituary. And I remember writing the obituary, and the tradition is so and so Takashi Joe Masumoto was married to Carol parentheses Sugimoto Masumoto. And that was a tradition. You put in maiden names. And I thought, why do you put that in? I have to say, at that point when I was writing it, they charge you by word count in the obituary. So I thought, well, if I leave out a couple words, I can save us some money. Well, I did follow tradition and put my mom's maiden name. That's how the funeral home, which was my dad's funeral home, was in Selma, but I guess the funeral homes have a network, so they share information. So this other Fresno funeral home saw this listing in a database, phoned the Selma funeral home to get my phone number, and that's how they contacted me. The idea, though, that I still had the same phone number, I still was living at the same place because we farm, and this was, of course, the same place that in many ways our family had literally for generations on that. And it was a way that they could look us up, they could find us. And we forget, when you farm, you leave behind those footprints. And it's these footprints that others could then trace back part of that legacy and part of that story. story. And one of the ways that we followed back, though, was of course understanding what are those whole networks of people around us. And for Shizuko in this book, one of the key things were her caregivers, because how do you survive 70 years of institutional care? You had to have good people around you that took care of you. And it reminded me so much of how in organic farming, we are caregivers of the soil, of the earth, of the plants, and really the whole ecosystem around food. So I used that parallel to start probing into this family secrets and exploring this role of caregivers. And I'll read a little bit from Secret Harvest. My Aunt Shizuko's caregivers manifest an invisible army of philanthropists. They grow to help beyond their job descriptions. They assist in many ways obscured and hidden. They radically support a system of caring by working in this heart of darkness, a clandestine and often too often concealed universe of people with disabilities and the elderly. They nourish the power of the human spirit to thrive in difficult situations. In many ways, when I wrote this, I said, this sounds like organic farming, where we toil so much in this cloak of invisibility, and at the same time, we work with this kind of passion in order to share it, and in that way, reframing it as if farmers are caregivers, and we are. Makes you help understand our role in our position. And in looking at Shizuko's life, she had a whole army of caregivers that 70 years managed to take care of her. Because when we first found her, she was 92 and she passed away 2 years after that. So 94, living with a fairly significant disability and 70 years of institutional care. It was phenomenal. Phenomenal to think about that kind of timeline that was involved. But in many ways, Shizuko's story and this probing into this story made me think of other ways of how the kind of spirit in many ways gets planted into us. And it's that spirit in many ways, I think, that manifested how I farm and how I've grown to farm too. Uh, there's a passage in Secret Harvest where uh, I look about this idea of Shizuko like a ghost. It's a spirit that's part of our land. And it's interesting because our farm dates back and we have 100-year-old grapevines in front of our house. There was a possibility, I know for a fact, that these vines were pruned by Japanese American laborers at one point. And there's a good chance that my grandparents pruned these vines, probably took Shizuko with them. Uh, I was like that as a kid, and I see some farm families do that, where the kids come out to the fields, play, sit under a grapevine while the parents are working on that. So here's a passage from Secret Harvest. Shizuko lingers like a ghost shimmering in the faint bands of light against the darkness. In the end, it's all about questions that haunt and provide us comfort as we ponder the Japanese term gamman, which means to persevere. The security I've been granted in my lifetime hid the reality of our family's history. Shizuko becomes my teacher when I am ready. Spring on the farm, and something is planted into us. And that's exactly how I've always farmed, with the seasons in many ways embedded into my own thinking, certainly my writing, but also how I interpret the world around us, and understanding that all this provides the backdrop for our family, and in this case, our family history, and explore these family secrets. And that in turn becomes really one of the biggest challenge, because as that phrase began, that video, every family has secrets. And if we were meeting in live, I'd do this exercise where I ask all of us to stop and pause and think of your own family secrets. And it's amazing when I shared that story with different people. And I'll tell you a quick one. Even our mechanic who comes and works on our trucks and tractors, and he's this older white guy, chain smoker, probably hasn't read a book in years, maybe decades. But he asked me, Moss, what are you working on? I told him this story about my Aunt Shizuko separated from our family, and it's about family secrets. So he pauses and he says, my family had a secret. And I said, "Oh, tell me what it is." And he goes, "My sister had 2 birthdays." And I said, "Really? What do you mean?" He says, "Well, growing up, we celebrated her birthday with my grandparents and in November, but her real birthday was in July. And it wasn't until he was older he realized his parents got married in March. So you suddenly start going, okay, I could see why they celebrated back then. But it was a sign of a family secret carrying the legacy of that moment in history and the values that we had at that time. So this explorations of secrets was really an exploration into my own psyche and thinking about things that were all around me and understanding that history that's embedded literally in the soil, literally in our crops. We grow, of course, organic peaches, nectarines, apricots, and grapes. And we have 100-year-old grapevines. Some of my best peaches are 60 years old, which is ancient for commercial orchards. But in that is embedded these decades and generations of history woven in there. Let me read a real quick other passage from Secret Harvest. History revolves around both nature and human nature on our farm. Actions have meaning, characters engage and withdraw, settings provide the stage and backdrop for drama. Who writes history? We constantly choose what to remember and what to forget. I came home to farm memories. And in many ways, when I came back to the farm, I didn't know that's exactly what I was going to do. But in many ways, that memory embedded in exactly how I farm. And organic farming is all about memory. If you think about it, the soil remembers. That's why they go through 3 years of transition to become organic, because you want to go through that passage. And there's rites of passage because most of us who farm do, I think, take care of our fields, and we begin to ask questions such as, what areas on the farm have more of a sandy loam versus a clay. Why? Because water penetrates very differently. And certainly this last rainstorms proved that to an extent. And you begin to understand those nuances and why are those soil types different on a farm? Well, you go back to where you're farming, what was the geographic memory of that. And in our part of Fresno, this whole Central Valley was a lake at one time. And also the Kings River runs due east of us. And I'm sure at one point it flooded its bank. That's why our soil is a sandy loam, which some people come and they go, this is like being on the beach. But I said, no, it's wonderful for me because I've learned how to farm with it, and I understand that memory of the soil because water penetrates in a very different way than some other neighbor that I have farming where they have clay, which I have no clue about how to farm in clay, but you have a very, very different relationship with the ground that way. Let me pause and sort of think of and share with you some of the ideas of how I got here. And in a way, our farming history and leading up to the story of Shizuko in many ways followed this legacy of the different books that I wrote. And I'll share a little bit about it and tell you the backdrop. One of the early first books I wrote was called Epitaph for a Peach. And this book was um, really a turning point for me because our farm became public. All right. This book is based on an old variety of peach that we have. And I'll just share this one paragraph that I think captures this peach. Suncrest is one of the last remaining truly juicy peaches. When you wash that treasure under a stream of cooling water, your fingertips instinctively search for that gushy side of the fruit. Your mouth waters in anticipation. You lean over the sink to make sure you don't drip on yourself. Then you sink your teeth into the flesh, and the juice trickles down your cheeks and dangles on your chin. This is a real bite, a primal act, a magical sensory celebration announcing summer has arrived. And I love that paragraph partly because it was one of the rare times in my life. It was at a moment during a summer harvest where no one wanted this peach. It had become homeless. So I sat down, I was pissed off, I was mad, and I pounded out that paragraph in about 5 minutes. And I said, hey, maybe I could be a writer. I've never been able to repeat that. But it was this whole idea of writing this book launched our farm into the world of food. And you think, well, wait a minute, you farm, aren't you always part of this world of food? Well, traditionally, we would grow our crops, load it on a truck, wave goodbye, and the only response we got back was what the price was. And it was more transactional. And all farming, all organic farming, really is based on relationships. So this book, Epitaph for a Peach, launched us into the food world. In a little backstory, it got nominated for a Julia Child Cookbook Award. And I went, what is a Julia Child Cookbook Award? This book doesn't have any recipes in it, but they have a category called literary food writing. So I went to the award ceremony and it actually won. And it actually threw us into this whole food world, which in the mid 90s was really starting to explode nationwide. And it really changed the course of our farm because now we weren't growing commodities, even more so, we were growing relationships. And it expanded into different things. And like Adam had talked about, that, even the idea of trying to extend our farm into a public arena. So we developed a program that we adopt a peach tree and people come to our farm to make one of the hardest decisions on the farm is, when is a peach ripe? And it's amazing and I love watching because usually that falls on the farmer. You have to decide what's a ripe peach and what's not a ripe peach. And the amazing thing that's happened to people is, of course, if you pick a green peach, there's no do-overs. You got that peach, you can't stick it back on the tree. And it was a fun educational process to watch people grapple with that and understand that, okay, I picked this greener peach, what do I do with it now? So I thought, you're wearing the hat of a farmer now, and you're understanding some of these decisions that permeate the work that we do. Another book I wrote right after that was called Secret Harvest. And this went back into the family legacy. And in this, I talk about going back to Japan and living with my relatives and understanding this is the roots of our farming. And it goes back to my family came from two areas of Japan. One was Hiroshima and one was Kumamoto. And for those of you who don't know, you've heard of Hiroshima and the tragic bombing of it. Kumamoto, it's sort of like the Fresno of Japan. If you say you're from Kumamoto, people go, oh, country people. Those of you who have been in Fresno, you understand it's this whole area is had the reputation of being very country-ish. But in this book, in Harvest Sun, I talk about daily implements such as a shovel and how a shovel becomes a timeline for a farm. And the reason why I bring that up is this shovel was at one point at a point, and it was slowly abraded and worn down literally through generations. This is a shovel that my dad used with that in that. And it was a great way of looking at the legacy of farming through a different eye, through different eyes, literally through the implements that we use. And it does mark time on a farm. And the wonderful thing about that for me is understanding my mark. So this is a shovel that I inherited, and I am really happy to say I've worn it down a lot more too. And this is my favorite shovel. And the reason why is it has my fingerprints all over it. It's worn down. And for those of you who are older, you'll understand a shovel full of a new shovel gets damn heavy. So I love this because it has aged with me in many ways. Our daughter likes using a much bigger shovel, so she has her own that will slowly wear down. But it's that kind of idea that if you look around everyday objects on a farm, it carries that sense of history and legacy with it. And whoever thought of looking at a shovel as a timeline of your time spent on a farm? So all of you who are involved in agriculture or gardening, look at your tools and understand that if you could hang on to that for a while, you'll pass down a legacy at the same time. Whether or not a younger generation will pay attention to it, it's not my problem. It's just that this is the implement that we use and stuff. And they'll learn the lesson too as they age. Having a smaller shovel actually is much healthier for an aging body too. I also wrote a book called Four Seasons in Five Senses. And this book was the idea of looking at the farm through the senses. And I'll just paraphrase one story. On our farm, we use pheromones, which are a way of disruption for insect control. And if you don't know what pheromones are, what it is on our tree fruit, there are pheromones for like oriental fruit moth, peach twig borer, and omnivorous leaf roller. And these pheromones are these little plastic strips that have this little black dot that has little holes, and inside the pheromone is the scent of the female moth. So if you have oriental fruit moth, there's the scent of the female oriental fruit moth in this strip, and you hang it throughout the fields. We do it one in each tree. And the idea is that it prevents the male from finding the female because it flies into the field. So when our kids were younger, we go out as a family and hang these strips because I wanted to explain to them this is what organic farming is about. We're not spraying these chemicals. We're doing this, and actually, it's fairly significant technology because with pheromones, each female moth has its own type of pheromones aroma. So the oriental fruit moth is different than the peach twig borer, so you have to hang two different strips for that. Uh, so when we were doing it with my daughter, who was like maybe 13 at that time, she was didn't quite understand. So I tried to break it down to a real simple language, like, okay, the female has a scent, and in these little strips is that scent, and it fills the field with this aroma. So when the male flies into the field, it tries to look for the female, but it gets confused and it can't find the female. And so my daughter says, so males are typically mixed up, aren't they? And of course, my wife was with us and we're hanging too. And she goes, oh, confused males. Nikiko, that's something you're going to need to really learn about that. This is very typical. So they went off in this whole different direction. And I was trying to give this lesson about farming and technology and science and this way of using things organically. But they were taking it in a very different path about, mating disruption and safe sex in the fields and all kinds of things too. But the wonderful story about that was, of course, looking at the farm through the senses. And part of that sense was a sense of family and understanding this is how knowledge, legacy, and stories are passed down on that. So it was really fun to work on a book like this and not talk about it so much from a scientific viewpoint, although pheromones are very scientific in that sense, but also understand that's the dynamic of how a farmer wears many hats, and in this case wears the hat of being a quasi-scientist in that sense, and understanding how things work and don't work out there, and trying to see how family in this wild way could get woven into this kind of story that we're telling. Later, I wrote a book called Wisdom of the Last Farmer. And this was really talking about my father, and he had a stroke on the farm, and it was me trying to get him back to working on the farm. And one of the things we shared were stories about the farm. My dad was not a storyteller, but after his stroke, we began to share more experiential stories. And that for me was at the heart of farming, not so much the words, but the experience of it. So we it, we he pointed out a lot of things about a certain thing that all farms have, and that's a junk pile. And I'll read you a passage of that. All good farms have a junk pile. It stays with the land and the succession of owners who contribute to the collection of odd machine parts, old equipment, and discarded but never forgotten stories. Since I have a forklift, my first major contribution to the pile is to restack most of it onto wood pellets. Now I have a portable junk pile. I can move stuff from place to place, sort of like a modern archaeologist using machinery during their rummage through history. I use junk to fix things and glean ideas and inspiration. When a sculptor friend and I probed through the pile, he was enthralled by the variety of odd shapes and angles. We pulled out a bright orange forked steel teeth implement from some kind of harvester, sat it upright and then on its side, and then buried it and made comments about it. He called it modern art. I left it in place for a few months, then dug it out when I needed to cultivate that area, tossing it back onto the junk pile, calling it postmodern art. In my junk, treasures lie hidden. Old pieces from equipment tell me the history of a farm. It's as if time is left behind in these relics, not as fossils or memorials to the past. These remains are to be used by future farmers. After I spoke at a farm conference in Wisconsin, an old farmer dressed in overalls approached me to talk about his junk pile. Out here, we don't call them junk piles, he announced. And I thought he was going to use a term that I had heard of from my wife's family called bone pile. And that term is rarely used in California. Instead, he said, out here we call them. And then he leaned closer as if he wanted to whisper a secret. Here we call them inspiration and inventory. And I love that idea of looking at junk as inventory. And in a way, that's the same way I think of stories and how stories become part of that inventory. And Shizuko, my aunt, becomes part of that inventory for a farm. And lately we just did another book with my daughter called Changing Season, and it was about a series of essays about it. And one essay, and I won't read it, but it talked about the idea of thinking slow and working slow, which is somewhat the antithesis of looking at modern business, and it's all about pace and productivity and efficiency. And I love to look at it through a very different lens in that. I love to look at cultural ways of looking at things and understanding how culture, such as the story of a lost ant, becomes part of our farm in many ways. And I'll just paraphrase this one part too, because it's one of the, I think, a really significant part from Secret Harvest. But it talks about this term called wabi sabi, which is this Japanese term, and uh, it talks about looking at the world through this different lens. And I think when you farm organically, you have to understand that this is the whole dynamic of organic farming. And wabi sabi literally translates into three ideas: that you work with the world and things are imperfect, incomplete, and in a way never ending, impermanent. So you think of those three ideas: imperfect, incomplete, and impermanent. And that's how we approach the farm. Part of embedded in that with a sense of time. When you think things are incomplete and impermanent, the story, like a lost ant, suddenly gets woven into the fabric of our farm, and it fits perfectly, as opposed to, no, 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 that story of a lost ant doesn't fit in modern farming. And no, actually it does, because her story is really a story about disabilities. And in writing this book and exploring it, made me relook at the lens of disabilities in our world. People with disabilities, but then getting back to thinking of imperfect fruit, in fruit that actually has a kind of a different type of futures that's going to evolve, incomplete in that sense. In our farm, because our daughter and our son are farming with me, our farm is incomplete, because they will add their chapter onto the farm no differently than when I came back to the farm. I started adding something different to the farm too. So that sort of gave you an outline of Secret Harvest and some of the things. And just to let you know, if anyone comes to Eco Farm, I'll be doing a keynote talk at Eco Farm, exploring this idea of the power of stories in the work that we do. And it's stories that get so often are overlooked because we're so driven by either technology, economics, and things like that. So, for example, I've gotten very interested in behavioral economics, and I'm not an economist at all. But what I love about behavioral economics is it starts with the premise that humans behave irrationally. And I love that, because that's exactly how our farm is. It's irrational how things work out. I try to manipulate a few things, but things evolve in different ways. So that will is a summary of Secret Harvest, and I hope you enjoyed that. And I'd love to have time now if people had any questions or anything to engage with that. And if you can, unmute your screen, and Jane, maybe you could help in terms of who gets to ask a question, or raise your hand, and we go in that perspective, in that way too. So I hope you enjoyed some of these stories that I told, and really the backstory to Secret Harvest, but also our farm in many ways. So Molly, I see you had your hand up.
Thanks, Mas. Wonderful to hear about your new work, and of course, appreciate all of the books that you've written and all of the uh, ways that you've woven humanity into agriculture in such beautiful storytelling. I was really sort of struck by this notion of shame that you were mentioning
Mhm,
earlier.
mhm,
I think it's something we can all relate to, and certainly in my own specifically Japanese American story here in California, there's that rings true as especially ties to World War II and internment.
mhm,
And and it made me think a little bit about how in organic agriculture and agriculture in general, especially at a time right now, there's this idea that there's maybe a right way to do things and a
mm,
wrong way to do things, and
mhm,
all that we're learning about um, the impacts to planet Earth and the choices that we make. And for those of us engaged in helping support farmers who want to transition to organic or maybe reach across into conventional producers who haven't considered it, but maybe we
mhm,
want them to consider it. Um, and I was curious to hear your thoughts on how does this idea of shame play into choices that have maybe been made in by agricultural producers, and how would you approach speaking to conventional producers in a way that, we don't want them to necessarily feel bad about what they've been doing, but we want them to understand there's also some damage that may be happening because of those choices. And just if you could
mhm,
reflect on
mhm.
that idea for a moment.
Oh, very good. Wonderful question, Molly. And yes, shame enters our family in many ways. Certainly, Molly, you probably went through this. My parents and grandparents who were interned during World War II for 4 years in a prison, they rarely spoke about that. So growing up, they called it camp, right? So I had this different image of, oh, they're in camp, but that's what they used almost as a euphemism to sort of, and it was their way, I think, of coping with that because my mom was 13 years old and she was arrested as a prisoner and spent 4 years in prison. So what kind of trauma does that leave? And I think the way they coped with it was, of course, trying to, one, maintain the silence, and two, that sense of perseverance. And there's a Japanese term called shigata ganai, which is a lot in Secret Harvest. And shigata ganai simply translates into it can't be helped, right? And I love that term because it embodies both the human emotion of things, but farming, right? Because a lot of conventional agriculture is based on the idea of controlling things, controlling how things grow, controlling the inputs you put in, trying to control prices and distribution as much as possible. It doesn't capture the idea of weather and climate change, right? Because you can't control that. And for some reason, conventional agriculture sort of, pretends that it controls that kind of thing. I think one of the powers of looking at shame and farming, especially in agriculture, I think organic farming understands the power of bad. And now let me share that. As a writer and a journalist too, we are human nature is driven by to listen for bad stories. We will listen and it'll pique our curiosity of, oh, an accident happened, someone died, there was something bad. I'll give you a quick story. When we had all these spring rains that were inundating and damaging certain farms, we were lucky in our area, right? Because we weren't inundated with it. And I don't live near a river, and the rivers were running in different directions. But I got a call from NPR, and NPR says, I heard of the rains that are hitting California. Can you tell me about it? So I said, yeah, it was great on our farm. I mean, we're having good water penetration. There's a beautiful snowpack. We're going to get water all through the summer. And I went on, and there was silence. And then the reporter goes, oh, and I realized she wanted to hear the bad story because she knew that would make the newscast more of how, the farm was, my orchards were underwater and I'm going to lose all this. And, I won't be able to pay off my loans and I might have to quit farming. She wanted to hear that. It's the power of bad, and it's part of human nature to want to listen to bad. In a funny way, conventional farming tries to hide bad as much as possible because conventional farming is much more about control. I would hope organic farmers understand it's not about control, it's about trying to just live with nature. as much as possible. So you're gonna have to understand the power of bad. And it's in bad cases you learn lessons. Molly, you learned it while you're trying these different things to grow, right? And I would think like Danielle, the idea of bad in Imperial Valley affects you in a very different way than Molly or I do with that and stuff. I'm sure you're thinking of that hurricane that was coming up, and if it tracked a little further east, you're going to understand the power of bad in a very, very different way in that. So it drives us in what we do, and we could learn from that idea of power of bad and not be ashamed of the bad things that happened. Uh, I remember when we were first farming organically, I felt bad and a bit shameful because all these weeds were taking over our fields, and neighbors would drop by. And one neighbor pulled over to my wife as she was on the roadside and said, to Marcy, Marcy, is everything okay on your farm? And Marcy said, yeah, why? Things are fine. He goes, I look at your fields, and with all the weeds, there's something bad happened to moss. And he thought, and it was a kind neighbor, but he thought I had injured myself or gotten very sick, and that's why all these weeds were everywhere. It was that power of bad that was driving this relationship, so it was a part of that learning curve to deal with that. So hopefully that sort of helped that understand that power of bad. And how the power of bad, there was this theory that a journalist came up with, that for every bad things, you have to have four good things happen to make up for the one bad. So, when a rainstorm comes, I will try to make up four good things that happen to try to compensate for the bad thing. And I know I'm kidding myself, but it's how you cope with it, because the power of bad does stick with you. And, sort of like, oh, I'll remember in 2007, we had this really horrendous year on the farm, and my wife would stop me and say, well, how about 2008, 9, and 10, and 11? Weren't they good years? And I go, oh, yeah, but I remember 2007 and all this other stuff. So you just try to learn to balance, I think, a lot of that and understand it is a potent force. And how does that affect literally our farming? Because when you farm organically, you're going to make mistakes and things are going to happen, but that's all part of the learning curve with that too. So hopefully that helped. Thank you, Molly. Any other questions? And you could always ask a question on the chat too, because Jane will flag that, or I'll look at that too. So, hmm
Well, I've got a question for you, Moss.
hmm
So in Epitaph for a Peach, actually in your original piece that you wrote for the Los Angeles Times before you
good
wrote the
memory.
book, you're documenting tearing out the last of your Suncrest peach trees. But I noticed on your website that you are still selling Suncrest peaches. So I'm wondering if you can share the story of how you were able to keep growing and selling Suncrest peaches.
Oh, thank you very much, Jane, for that question. You're absolutely right. It was the middle of summer. No one wanted this Suncrest peach. And the Suncrest peach is a beautiful, it's fairly large peach. It has a couple flaws. And one flaw is when it's ripe, it's golden yellow. It's not red, right? And the second flaw was it's a little delicate, so it won't last on a grocer's shelf for about 2 years. Okay, it's a real peach in that sense. So we had brokers and buyers that did not want this peach. It had become blacklisted. No one wanted. They said stay away from it. Uh, so I remember at that point we had like 2,000 25-pound boxes of Suncrest in already packed and ready to be shipped, and no one wanted them. And our broker phoned me and said, you'd be better off if you dumped the fruit out and we reused the box. And I said, I refuse to do that. So I came home. I was mad. As I said, I sat down and in a few minutes pounded out this editorial and the LA Times picked it up and ran it and syndicated nationwide. And it was the beginning of this story and understanding the power of story that's behind the foods we eat. And there was this audience for this story. Audience so much for a couple of newspapers picked it up, and one was this woman in Nevada, and she wrote me a letter. And she wrote, Mas Masumoto, Delray, California. And Delray is so small, it got to me, right? And she goes, I read your piece about your Suncrest peaches and how you can't find a home for it. And my broker ended up selling them for a 25-pound box for about $5. All right. And it was terrible, So she wrote that she calculated, she goes, I did some of the math and I love love to taste this wonderful peach. And where can I buy 25 pounds for $5? So that was her response to this, and I thought, okay, there's this different audience out there for those stories. But it did, as I say, launch me into this food world of thinking of stories and the work that we all do in organic farming that goes beyond the farm. And it's this relationship that we have between the work we do and the end user. And that relationship is what drives us, certainly with price, but also with interest, demand, with understanding how that can overcome the power of bad, where you have good comments and good dynamics with that. And I think that was so important. So that's why when Epitaph was published, it launched us and our farm into this other world. And then as I continue writing, even with Secret Harvest, it tells this backstory of our farm in a very different way through the lens of family and history, and how that's very much part of our farm. And most people tend not to think of a peach has history. And certainly the Suncrest peach, because everyone told me to get rid of it, to pull it out. And I write about that in Epitaph, where my neighbor had some Suncrest peaches too. And I had about maybe 3 or 4 acres, and he had about 5 acres, which was standard at that time. He called in a bulldozer. And the bulldozer came, and he goes, and I remember this guy, big guy with, smoking a cigar. And he goes, all right, where do I yank him out? And I said, why don't you start with my neighbors first? So he did his neighbors, and I was torn whether I should yank this out or not. So he finished my neighbors, and I heard this, hours of a bulldozer with a grunting sound, and you could hear roots being ripped and bark and trunks being smashed and cracking. And it was a terrible sound because I felt, death was happening in there. So he came over to our fields, and I remember him coming, and I stood in front of the bulldozer, and I remember this image of Tenement Square in China when the students were protesting, and this one student stood in front of a tank that was coming to stop the Chinese authority putting down the student protest. Well, I stood in front of this bulldozer and stopped it from coming, and he came over, and I said, you know, I think I'm going to keep this orchard. And then he barked back quite correctly. It's going to cost you more when I have to come back a second time. And I said, I understand that. So he left, and that carried on this legacy of I'm going to keep this orchard no matter what the bad stories I was hearing. So I've kept it, and it turns out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. Wrote the book, wrote other things about it, started exploring the relationships of markets at that time. Whole Foods was just getting off the ground at that time, going national. So even our small little operation, we became a national supplier for Whole Foods, and organic was starting to explode in the marketplace too. And the whole interest in food in a different way began to take off. And that's when I began to realize that no, it's not just about the economics of what we do. There's much more to it. So that continued that way, and that's where we are today. So we still have these trees that are over 60 years old. I helped planted them when I was a teenager, and I remember that because I was very impatient. And I remember planting. My dad planted one row, and I was planting another row, and of course I was much slower, and I was in a rush because I didn't want to be here, and I didn't think we'd ever bother with these trees again in my life because I wanted to get off the farm at that time. So my rows weren't straight. And now for 60 years, whenever I have to do any work in that field, I could tell the row I planted because I have to weave in and out of the orchard that way. But here we are now, years later. and we still have this orchard, and it's doing fantastic too. And we really, really understand that too. And it's wonderful as I've gotten older, Jane. It's wonderful to be working with other old things because you understand the value of aging. Of course, my wife joked and said, but sometimes some of the trees that are getting pretty old, don't we have to apply and use euthanasia? And I go, yeah, that could happen. But it's this understanding though that you're living with nature and the different things that really really work that way too. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you. That's amazing. I think we've got time for one more question. If anybody would like to pose one of Mas, or some
Well, if
closing
there's no other
words.
questions, let me conclude with the idea that and I really enjoyed sharing these stories with you. And again, it's not so much a formula or anything, it's really the power of story that we're working with here on the farm. And almost every organic farm, this goes back to the idea, every organic farm has a story. And it also, every organic farm, I think, has a secret. And I'd love to hear later if I ever run into you someplace, what is the secret of your farm? And the secret is really embedded in what kind of question do you really want to ask if your trees could talk or your ancestors could talk? What question would you ask them? And that question is going to lead to stories. So I urge all of you to think of what question would you like to ask a family member, a neighbor, someone that's involved with your organic farming. What question would you like to ask? Because it's going to lead to a great story and it will lead to a relationship that's born out of that. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this exchange and this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mas. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.